Every month on the exact same day, I placed an envelope on his porch, my hands trembling not from the cold but from decades of guilt. I believed this was the price I owed for the accident that took my husband and ruined another man's life. I never imagined that the truth I feared for so long wasn't mine to carry. My name is Margaret Hale, a widow from a quiet town in northern Oregon, and for more than 20 years I worked endlessly to pay financial restitution to the man who claimed my husband destroyed his life. The town barely changed since the night of the accident, but I did, shrinking under the weight of guilt that never loosened its grip. My children now have families of their own and can no longer help, while my aging body can't keep up with the work required to survive. And just when I thought things couldn't get worse, the man I've been supporting for decades, my husband's old friend, demanded even more money, pushing me back into a past I've tried so hard to bury. The fog was thick enough that morning to blur the pine trees behind my house. It rolled in slow, like it didn't want to disturb anything, not even the cold air hanging in my kitchen. The envelope lay on the table in front of me, thin, damp at the corners, as if it already knew where it was going. I didn't open it. I never did. I just pressed my palm over the sealed flap and listened to the house settle around me, the way old houses do when they're tired, or when the person inside them is. It was the first of the month, and that meant Redwood Street. I drove the same route every time, taking the back road behind Miller's farm, where the fields always looked half awake and the air smelled of damp soil. Oregon mornings have a way of sinking into your bones, especially when you've lived with the same routine for longer than you care to admit. The heater in my old sedan fought to warm the windshield. I kept both hands on the wheel, the envelope sitting in the cup holder like a silent passenger. $10,000. A number that had stopped feeling real to me years ago. Now was just wait. Promise. A punishment I had accepted without question. Redwood Street appeared through the fog like it always did. Hushed, colorless, almost ashamed of itself. The duplex where Ronald Pierce lived was slouched between two larger homes, paint peeling like curled paper. His porch light was always on, even in daylight. I never knew if it was broken, or if he kept it that way for effect. I stopped at the curb, the gravel crunching under my tires. For a moment I stayed inside the car, listening to my breath fog the glass. I didn't want to get out. I never wanted to. But guilt is a powerful thing. It moves your hands before your mind is ready. When I stepped out, the cold mist clung to my sweater. I walked slowly, the envelope softening between my fingers. By the time I reached the porch, tiny beads of moisture had already seeped into the paper. I placed the envelope beside the rusted welcome mat, the same spot as always, and took a step back. I didn't knock. Ronald didn't like knocking. He said it startled him. I stood there for a heartbeat longer than necessary, waiting for something. I don't know what. Sign. Shift. A whisper of forgiveness from a life that had gone wrong. But Redwood Street stayed quiet. It always did. When I turned back toward my car, I felt my age in my bones. Not the number but the years of bending, carrying, enduring. My back tightened halfway down the walkway, the familiar ache spreading like an unwelcome reminder that time doesn't bargain. The drive home felt longer than usual. The fog gave way to thin sunlight, and for a moment I wished it hadn't. Fog lets you hide. Sunlight doesn't. Inside my kitchen, the bills waited in a neat stack by the fruit bowl. I had put them there last night, trying to make them look manageable. But no matter how neatly you arrange a burden, it doesn't shrink. It just stares back at you. I sank into the wooden chair, the one Andrew used to sand down every spring because he said the edges were too sharp. I let my hand glide across the seat. It was still smooth. Still his. My phone buzzed. Text from my daughter, Sarah. I'm so sorry. We just can't help this month. Things are really tight with the kids. Her words softened the blow, but the meaning stayed hard. A moment later, another message. Please don't be upset. I wasn't upset. Just tired. Tired in the way that sinks into your chest and refuses to leave. I typed back something gentle. Something motherly. Something that didn't show even a fraction of what I felt. And then I sat there, listening to the refrigerator hum, watching the weak afternoon light slide across my kitchen floor. Felt like nothing and everything all at once. Evening settled slowly, stretching shadows across the ceiling. I made tea but didn't drink it. The steam carried a scent of chamomile that reminded me of the nights Andrew used to read in the living room, glasses slipping down his nose. I tried not to picture the accident. But memory doesn't ask permission. By the time the phone rang, the house was quiet enough that the sound made me flinch. I knew who it was before I picked up. I pressed the receiver to my ear. "Hello." There was a pause. Ronald always paused like he wanted me to feel the weight of the silence before he spoke. Then his voice came through, low and rough. "Margaret, we need to talk about next month." My stomach tightened. "Is something wrong?" Sharp exhale. "My doctor says I've got complications. Nerve damage, spreading pain." His words felt practiced, rounded on the edges. "I'm gonna need more than 10,000. A lot more." The kitchen light flickered, as if reacting for me. I swallowed slowly. "Ronald, you know I'm doing everything I can. I'm barely managing as it is." He didn't soften. He never did. "You owe me, Margaret. Your husband caused this. I'm living with what he did." The words landed the same way they always had. Heavy, unchallengeable, final. But this time, something in them felt wrong. Too sharp. Too precise. Almost rehearsed. Before I could think further, he ended the call. Just silence again. I stood there for a long moment, the phone still warm in my hand. The refrigerator hummed. The house breathed. Outside, a car drove past slowly, its headlights sliding across the window like a passing thought. I told myself Ronald must be in pain, that he had every right to ask, that I had every obligation to give. But underneath that familiar script, another feeling stirred, faint, fragile, unfamiliar. Not anger, not suspicion, more like a wobble in something that had always felt solid. I felt it in my chest first. Tremor. Crack. As if the story I'd lived inside for decades had shifted a fraction of an inch. The envelope on Redwood Street. The fog clinging to the paper. The way Ronald paused before speaking. The sharpness in his demands. The nervousness I hadn't noticed before. Crack is quiet. Almost invisible. But once it forms, it doesn't stop. I turned off the kitchen light, letting the darkness settle in like a blanket. I sat near the window, listening to the soft ticking of the wall clock, steady, patient, unbothered by the storms inside me. Outside, the fog had returned, rising from the ground in slow curls. I watched it drift past the street lamps and thought about the envelope sitting on Ronald's porch, soaking in the cold night air. I didn't know it then, but that was the last month the story would stay the same. The first crack had formed, and the truth was already on its way. The photograph always looked different at night. Maybe it was the lamplight, or maybe it was just me getting older. But whenever the house sank into its quiet, that frame on the side table seemed to glow like it had its own heartbeat. I found myself sitting on the floor again, knees stiff, the air colder near the hardwood. Andrew's smile, frozen the way the world wanted to remember him, watched me from behind the glass. I hadn't touched the frame yet, but I could feel it pulling at me, the way grief does when it thinks you aren't looking. Illinois nights have a way of settling heavy on a house built from old wood. Every seam remembers a winter. Every plank remembers footsteps long gone. When the heater kicked on, it filled the room with a low hum, like someone clearing their throat before speaking. Made me feel less alone. The lamp beside me flickered once, then steadied, warming the corner where the photograph had lived for 33 years. It used to sit on the mantel, back when people still visited. Bit by bit it migrated lower, quieter, until it found this small table beside my reading chair. Now it stayed there, almost shy, like it knew its presence carried weight. I reached out and turned the frame toward me, just slightly. Andrew stood in front of our first home. Paint peeling, porch crooked, the kind of thing two young people thought they could fix with love and weekends. He looked proud in the picture, shoulders strong, hair catching the light like he'd been carved from something honest. But every time I saw that smile, I felt a pinch of something behind my ribs. Not grief. Not anymore. Shame had a different temperature, colder, patient. I carried it for decades. The belief that Andrew caused the crash, that Ronald's injury was on his head, and that the universe was simply handing me what I deserved. Tonight, though, something about the picture felt wrong. Not wrong, alive. As though it was finally ready to tell me something. I lifted the frame into my hands. The wood was cool, the back covered in a thin film of dust I hadn't bothered to clean. I held it like a fragile confession, my thumbs pressing into the corners where fingerprints had probably faded years ago. The house was too quiet, even for me. The clock in the hallway clicked in slow, deliberate beats. A car passed outside, its headlights sweeping briefly across the living room curtains. Just enough light slipped through to dance across the photograph. And that's when I saw it. Not the smile. Not the house behind Andrew. Something smaller. His left hand, partially cropped out, was gripping something at his side. I had seen that picture 1,000 times but never noticed the angle of his wrist, the shadow falling across his palm. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the glass. It wasn't clear. Old photos rarely were, but there was a shape there. Something metallic. Tool. Piece of the porch. Or maybe nothing at all, just the way the light hit the print 30 years after it was taken. Still, the unease began to move, soft and steady, like a whisper sliding beneath a closed door. I blinked hard, shaking the image back into place. The photograph had always been a window to a fixed moment, unchanging, unmoving. But tonight it felt like the past was shifting under my feet, asking me to look again, to stop assuming I already knew the whole story. The room felt smaller. Or maybe I was just breathing too shallow. I set the frame on my lap and stared until my eyes began to sting. Shame had lived inside me so long it had settled into a familiar shape, like a tenant who pays rent late but never leaves. But this quiet stirring didn't feel like shame. Felt like doubt. And doubt, after all these years, was dangerous. I remembered the night of the crash in pieces, like shards of a broken plate nobody bothered to glue back together. Rain on the windshield. Andrew's voice too tight. Ronald's small hand on my arm. Headlights blooming like stars. Then the sound, metal folding, glass breaking, bones becoming something soft and wrong. For years I told myself Andrew must have grabbed the wheel. That his frustration, his stubbornness, his pride had caused the car to yaw off the road. It was easier to let blame settle on him than to consider the alternative, that I had been wrong or blind, or simply unable to face whatever truth lived inside that moment. But now, staring at the photograph, something in me shifted. Andrew's smile. It wasn't the smile of a man who hid things. It wasn't the smile of someone capable of the recklessness I had carved into his memory. It was warm, open, uncomplicated. My chest tightened not with pain, but with the slow, creeping question. What if I misunderstood? What if the story I carried all these years had been bent? What if I punished myself, and him, for something neither of us ever did? The thought frightened me more than the grief ever had. I placed the photograph back on the table, angling it the way it had been before. The lamplight caught the glass again, soft and gold, turning Andrew's face into something almost living. I let my hand rest on the frame longer than I meant to, feeling the cold give way to warmth. The house breathed around me, settling into its familiar night. But something inside me stayed awake. For the first time in decades, the past didn't feel sealed shut. It felt like a door cracked open at the end of a hallway. Dark inside, quiet, waiting. I drew in a slow breath. Maybe it was time to look again. Maybe the truth hadn't died with him. Not yet. The numbers on the bank screen looked smaller in the morning light. I don't know why that surprised me. Money always seems to shrink when you stare at it long enough. The teller's keyboard clicked softly, almost kindly, like she didn't want to disturb whatever was left of my pride. I held the thin printout between my fingers, the paper trembling even though the air inside the bank was still. Outside, someone laughed. Inside, I felt the walls inch a little closer. There was no saving it anymore. Not the house. Not the past. Not the life I had held together with thread. Banks used to intimidate me. Now they just tired me. The fluorescent lights hum overhead, too bright for the kind of news they shine on. The line behind me shifted, shoes squeaking against polished tile. I could feel a headache blooming behind my eyes, slow and steady, like a storm that didn't want to announce itself. The teller, young, polite, trying not to look worried for me, slid the papers across the counter. "Take your time," she said. "People only say that when you don't have any time left." My balance stared up at me, a number that felt colder than the Oregon rain outside. I'd stretched everything as far as it could go, sold off the things nobody would miss. Skipped repairs I pretended weren't urgent. But the math was loyal to the truth, and it stood firm. I wouldn't make the next payment. I pressed my thumb against the place where a ring used to sit. Andrew's ring. I hadn't worn it in years, but sometimes the skin there still felt warm. The decision I'd been avoiding settled itself inside me with a heaviness that felt almost tender, like it wanted to spare me the trouble of choosing. List the house. The house where Andrew fixed the kitchen window after our first fight. Where Ronald learned to walk, clinging to the shelves Andrew built with hands more patient than mine. Where silence grew over the years, but never fully unkind. A lifetime wrapped in drywall and cedar. And now, a stack of papers waiting for my signature. The real estate office smelled of coffee and wet coats. The agent, Diane, had the kind of energy that made you feel like she'd been awake for hours before the sun. She shook my hand with a practiced warmth and led me through the process, line by line, like guiding a child through homework. By the time we reached my house, the rain had softened to a mist. Diane stepped inside with her camera already hanging from her wrist. "This is a lovely property," she said. "Homes in this part of Oregon have been climbing in value for the last few years." Lovely. She didn't know how many arguments those walls had heard. How many prayers. How many nights I sat in the hallway because the bedroom felt too big for just me. She snapped photos of the living room, the one Andrew painted twice because the first color was too gloomy, even though I secretly loved it. She moved into the kitchen next, noting the light, the counter space, the age of the cabinets. Then she said it, just casually, like it was information meant for someone else entirely. For older properties, we sometimes run routine checks. Land records, past renovations, any reported incidents or accidents involving the homeowner. Standard stuff. The word accidents hit me the way cold water does. Sharp, immediate, waking something I thought was asleep. I tried to keep my breath even. Tried not to let my hands show what my heart felt. She didn't notice. She was already photographing the back door. I followed her through the house like a guest in someone else's memories. Each corner she photographed held a piece of Andrew I hadn't let myself look at in years. The old shelf he built in the hall. The stain on the ceiling he insisted was character. The window he kept promising to fix but never did. When Diane finished, she clicked her pen and smiled. "I'll send these in and start the preliminary checks. You'll get updates by the end of the week." My throat tightened around the word checks. It wasn't the present I was afraid of. It was the past she might uncover, the parts I'd twisted to survive, the truths I might have misremembered. After she left, the silence in the house settled like dust after a long disruption. I stood in the living room alone, the echo of her footsteps fading down the walkway. The room felt larger without her in it. Too large for one woman. Too full of ghosts for even two. I lowered myself onto the floor, the same place I used to sit when Ronald was small enough to crawl into my lap. The hardwood was cold beneath my palms, grounding me in a way nothing else had lately. Legal checks, accidents, homeowner history, words that should have meant nothing. But instead they curled around a thought I'd tried to bury years ago. Something about that night, the crash, the details I never let myself question. Flicker moved through me. Not hope. Not yet. Something smaller. Harper. Possibility. The rain returned just as the sun dipped behind the trees, turning the windows into shifting mirrors. The house smelled like empty rooms and old wood. Quiet, patient, waiting for whatever came next. I leaned my back against the wall and stared at the place where Diane had stood, camera raised, seeing my life as measurements and market value. But she'd also opened a door she didn't know existed, a crack in the past I thought was sealed. Something was shifting. I could feel it, a tiny spark so faint I almost mistook it for fear. Maybe this house wasn't done with me. Or maybe the truth wasn't. Either way, I wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. The knocking didn't sound like someone asking to be let in. It sounded like someone reminding the house that it still owed him something. I hadn't even turned off the faucet when the first thud shook the front door. The morning light was weak, still hiding behind the branches of the old maple tree outside. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. And as I walked toward the door, wiping my hands on a dish towel, I already knew who it was. Ronald's shadow pushed through the frosted glass like a storm cloud trying to get inside. I opened the door only halfway, the way you do when you're trying to protect whatever small piece you have left. Ronald stood on the porch with his shoulders locked tight, like he'd been practicing that stance in the mirror. His SUV sat crooked in the driveway, engine still running, breath huffing into the cold morning air. He didn't say hello. He didn't even nod. His eyes scanned past me into my house, the house I'd spent 43 years trying to keep standing. Soon it would be listed. Soon strangers would walk through it and try to decide if my memories were worth the asking price. But Ronald only saw numbers. I could tell from the way he pressed his lips together. "I need to talk to you," he said. His voice carried that familiar edge, impatience mixed with something darker, something that had been sharpening for decades. I stepped aside because there was no use trying to stop him. Ronald walked in and stood in the hallway as if waiting for me to hand him something he was owed. "What is it now?" I asked softly. He rubbed his lower back with a dramatic wince, the motion rehearsed. "The pain's worse. Can barely sleep. With everything you promised me after. After what Andrew did, I need more than what we discussed." I felt the words land heavy in the room. Andrew. He never let me forget. I motioned for him to follow me into the kitchen, if only because the house felt smaller when we spoke in narrow spaces. The old wood floors creaked under his weight. They remembered him just as well as I did. Ronald leaned against the counter, crossing his arms, his jaw tight. The morning sun finally slid through the blinds, striping the linoleum with thin, pale lines. "Ronald," I began, choosing each word the way someone chooses stones to step across a river. "I'm selling the house. I'm trying to keep up with the payments from these last few years. I can't give you more." He scoffed. Not loudly, just enough to make the air feel colder. "You think that matters to me?" he snapped quietly. "My pain's real. My doctor says the damage is permanent." I watched him shift his weight, exaggerating the gesture. He'd always been a good performer. "Andrew's mistake ruined my career," he continued. "Ruined my life. And you still think I should be grateful for what little you offered?" His voice rose not to a shout, but to that trembling pitch people use when they want you to feel guilty. I didn't answer. Sometimes silence is the only way to keep the truth from spilling out too soon. Ronald paced, rubbing his temple, breathing fast. Every few steps he glanced at me, as if checking whether his story was still working. But there was something else in his eyes that morning, something jittery and unsure. A flicker I'd never seen. Fear. Regret. I couldn't name it. Yet it unsettled me. He stopped in the middle of the kitchen, his shadow cutting across the sunlight. "You owe me," he said. "Your husband owed me. And since he's not here to pay for what he did, you need to handle it." There was a time when those words would have broken me. But now they just settled into the air like dust. I folded the dish towel over the back of a chair and spoke quietly. "Ronald, are you sure you remember the accident the way you think you do?" He froze. The question hung between us, barely a whisper, but powerful enough to push him back a step. His face tightened, not in anger but in something like surprise. For a second he didn't speak. Then his shoulders lifted as he inhaled sharply, almost flinching. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked. I didn't know how to answer. I only knew that Andrew, for all his flaws, had never lived a day without carrying guilt. Real guilt. Heavy guilt. The kind that eats at a person from the inside. Ronald's version of the story had grown over the years, swelling like a bruise. And every time he told it, the details changed. Just slightly, but enough for anyone paying attention. And I had been paying attention. Ronald stepped closer, invading the small circle of warmth around me. "Your husband's mistake cost me my whole life." He said it slowly. Too slowly. And for the first time I noticed how his eyes shifted. Not with pain, but with calculation. And something like panic. He left without waiting for my response. The door shut with a soft thud, more tired than angry. His footsteps faded down the porch steps, then the crunch of gravel as he hurried back to his SUV. I stood alone in the hallway, listening to the engine rev and disappear down the street. The house settled into quiet again. A quiet that felt different this time, as if the walls were holding their breath with me. I replayed his words, the way they trembled, the way his eyes slipped away at the wrong moment. "Your husband's mistake cost me my whole life." But as I stood in the dim light, my hand resting on the doorframe Andrew once repaired for me, I felt something shift inside. For the first time in decades, I wondered if that sentence had ever been true at all. The morning fog had not yet lifted when I pulled into the sheriff's lot. It clung to the patrol cars like a thin veil, softening the sharp edges of everything. The radios crackling inside, the worn steps leading to the entrance, even my own reflection in the glass door. For a long moment, I simply sat with the engine ticking as it cooled. My hands rested on the steering wheel, still and unsure, as though they were waiting for permission to move. I had not come here in decades. And yet, it felt like this building had been waiting for me. Inside, the sheriff's office was colder than I expected. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a steady droning sound that reminded me of hospital hallways, places where answers always came wrapped in too much silence. A young deputy sat behind the front desk, tapping at a computer with the distracted rhythm of someone used to long, uneventful mornings. He looked up when I approached, eyes warm but puzzled, the way people look when they recognize a kind of heaviness they cannot name. "Ma'am, how can I help you?" he asked. I explained quietly that I needed old reports. An accident. The year. Well, he saw the date before I even finished the sentence. His expression shifted before he caught himself. Not dramatically, just a small tightening around the eyes, a breath drawn slightly too slow. He clicked through screens, the mouse stuttering under his fingers. "That was a long time ago," he murmured. He nodded. "I know." He excused himself to walk into a back room, leaving me alone with the echo of my own heartbeat. I watched dust float in and out of the light beams from the window, careless and unbothered, the opposite of everything inside me. When he returned, a thin folder rested in his hands. His fingers pressed against it like he wasn't sure if he should let it go. "Are you certain you want to see this?" he asked softly. I did not answer with words. I simply reached out. The bench outside the station was cold, metal pressing through my coat. I placed the folder on my lap and hesitated, my thumb resting on the worn paper tab. The fog was beginning to lift, revealing the rolling fields across the road. Wide, open land that seemed too calm to hold any secrets. I opened the folder. The first page was a summary, typed neatly but strangely thin. There were no clear diagrams, no marked photographs, nothing that showed the full truth the way I remembered it. The smell of burnt rubber, the crunch of broken glass under the paramedic's boots, the way Andrew's voice cracked when he spoke to the officers. It all lived so vividly in me. But here was barely a paragraph. I flipped to the next page. A witness statement, incomplete. The last lines trailed off, the handwriting rushed. Another page referenced follow-up interviews that were missing entirely. Several fields had been left blank, as though time had swallowed pieces of the investigation. My heart thudded against my ribs. The fog drifted past again, softening the edges of the world, but not the ache growing in my chest. Where were the details? Where was the certainty Ronald had always claimed? Where was the evidence that had shaped the last 30 years of my life? My fingers trembled as I closed the folder halfway, needing air more than answers for a moment. The deputy stepped outside, leaning against the doorway with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. He watched me for a moment, perhaps deciding whether to approach. When he finally did, his steps were slow, respectful. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I noticed something when I pulled the file." His voice held that careful tone people use when speaking into someone else's wound. The officer who handled the case, he retired a long time ago, moved out of state. He nodded. He seemed to gather his words, piecing them together like he was sorting through delicate things. "We've started a cold case review initiative," he continued, "going through older files that feel unfinished." That word stayed in the air between us. Unfinished. He glanced at the folder on my lap. "If you want, I can put this on the list. No promises, but sometimes fresh eyes help." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The breeze pushed a strand of hair across my face, and I tucked it behind my ear with slow fingers. I looked down at the folder, its edges soft from years of handling, its pages worn thin from time. Something inside me stretched tight, almost to breaking, a mix of dread and hope, both too fragile to name out loud. "I don't know what I want," I finally whispered. He nodded gently. "You don't have to decide today." His kindness settled over me like warm sunlight. But beneath it lingered a quiet question, one I was not ready to face. What if the truth had been missing all along? I left the station with the folder tucked under my arm, the papers rustling softly with each step. The fog had thinned into a pale haze, drifting across the fields like memory, never fully gone, never fully clear. The gravel crunched under my shoes as I walked back to my car. Every sound felt louder than it should have. The click of my keys, the sigh of the door, the slow exhale I didn't realize I'd been holding. I placed the folder on the passenger seat, its presence heavier than anything its size should allow. As I started the engine, a pressure settled deep in my chest. Not pain, not fear, but something caught in between. Something that whispered, "This story isn't finished." The sun was barely over the treeline when my phone rang, one of those thin, cold morning calls that seemed to split the air in two. The detective's voice was steady, almost too steady, as he told me they'd located someone. A witness. Someone who had been there the night my life had been cleaved open. After the call ended, the house fell quiet again, but not a comforting quiet. More like the stillness before a storm decides where to fall. I stood at the kitchen window, staring at Highway 22 in the distance, the faint hum of passing trucks drifting toward me like ghosts. I didn't know it then, but I was standing on the edge of a truth I had never imagined. The diner sat alone off the highway, a squat building with peeling white paint and a flickering sign that buzzed in the breeze. I remembered passing it many times with Andrew years ago, the smell of coffee drifting out whenever the door swung open. I used to think of it as a warm place, the kind where truckers rested tired hands and families split waffles on Saturday mornings. Now, standing in its parking lot, the building felt different. Quiet, watchful. Samuel Briggs waited for me on a wooden bench beneath the large front window. He wore a denim jacket faded by sun and grease, and his hands were folded neatly in his lap. There was something steady about him, like a man who had lived long enough to understand the weight of time. "Mrs. Callahan?" he asked, his voice scratchy but gentle. "Yes," I said. The word felt small. We sat side by side, the bench groaning softly beneath us. Cars rushed by on Highway 22, their tires whispering across the asphalt. I watched the blur of them for a moment, remembering how that road looked on the night of the accident. Wet, dark, and unforgiving. "I heard from the detective," Samuel said, leaning forward slightly. "Said you wanted to know what I saw." I nodded again, though my throat had tightened. I'd been ready for many things in my life, but not for this. Samuel took a slow breath, the kind people take when they're about to dig through old memories. His eyes drifted toward the highway, as if he could still see the past moving across it. That night was cold, he began. Colder than most. I remember because the lights flickered inside the diner. We thought we'd lose power. His voice was calm, steady, but underneath I sensed hesitation, as though he'd been carrying something heavy for years. I was wiping down the counter, he continued, when I heard tires squeal. Loud. Long. He drew a line in the air with one finger. I looked up through the window and saw a pickup. Ronald's pickup. Already weaving across the lane. I felt the breath leave my lungs. He didn't look at me. Maybe he couldn't. He wasn't driving straight. He was drifting. A little left, a little right. Samuel paused, his jaw tightening. At first I thought he might have hit ice, but the road wasn't frozen yet. Not that night. My hands clasped together in my lap, knuckles pale. And the other car? I asked, though I already felt the answer like a thrum in my chest. Samuel swallowed. Your husband's car was steady. Entered. Not swerving. Not speeding. It was Ronald's truck that crossed over. A breeze swept across the highway, bending the dry weeds. The world didn't move, not really, but something inside me shifted like a rug pulled from under my feet. For a long moment I couldn't speak. My tongue felt heavy, my mouth dry, as if the truth had taken up all the space inside me. The guilt I had carried for more than half my life. The guilt that had settled into my bones, shaped my decisions, drained my savings, bent my back with age. Suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. Samuel finally turned to look at me. His eyes were soft, but not pitying. Just honest. And honesty, I realized, could hurt just as sharply as anything else. I told the officer that night what I saw, he said. But he rushed through the questions. Said he already knew what happened. Said the friend, Ronald, had explained everything. Samuel let out a slow sigh. I tried correcting him, but he waved me off. Told me to go home. The edges of the world felt too bright, too sharp. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the sound of passing cars wash over me. So you saw all of it, I whispered. Samuel nodded. I did. The truth sat between us. Quiet, undeniable, impossibly heavy. For decades, I had believed Andrew lost control. For decades, I had taken Ronald's anger, his accusations, his demands for money as punishment we deserved. But now the pieces rearranged themselves, and nothing looked the same. Driving home, the highway felt unfamiliar, as if someone had tilted the world 3 degrees to the left. My hands trembled around the steering wheel, the leather creaking beneath my grip. Every passing mile marker seemed to echo the witness's words. Ronald's truck was the one out of control. Ronald crossed the line. Ronald caused the crash. I slowed as I approached the bend in the road, the same direction Andrew once drove home from work every evening. For years, that bend carried the weight of blame. Now it carried something else, something cold and electrifying. A truth I wasn't ready for, but couldn't unhear. As the sun dipped behind the hills, I whispered into the quiet car. If this is true, then everything is about to change. The cold morning light hadn't quite settled when I stepped onto the station's front steps. It floated instead, thin and unfinished, like it wasn't sure it belonged here. Cars passed in the distance, their engines humming far away, but the world around me felt muted, like someone had laid a blanket over the noise. I stood there with my hands deep in my coat pockets, watching the frost cling to the railing. Something inside me tightened. Something old. Something I'd buried so carefully I almost convinced myself it never existed. But that morning I felt it waking. Inside the police station, everything smelled of old paperwork and colder intentions. The waiting chairs creaked when I sat, the kind of creak that reminded me of houses settling, or bones remembering past winters. I kept my eyes on the scuffed floor, tracing faint shoe marks as if they held answers. The officers were moving differently today. Slower, more deliberate. Whispering more than usual. I could hear bits of their conversations floating around me like dust motes in sunlight. The old files. Should have been caught the first time. Call him back in. Reno. They were talking about Reno. I wrapped my arms around myself, but the cold still pushed through the seams of my coat. It wasn't fear. At least, not the kind I used to know. This felt different. Like standing in the doorway of a room you've avoided for years, and realizing the air doesn't suffocate you anymore. One of the detectives, Officer Hayes, stepped out from the hallway with a folder pressed to his chest. He nodded toward me, not out of politeness but acknowledgement, respect, maybe even apology, and then he walked past, his steps heavy. That's when I knew something had shifted. Not in the building. In the story. The one I had been living inside for far too long. I didn't see Reno arrive, but I heard him. His voice carried down the hallway. A little too loud, a little too quick. He always spoke like someone trying to outrun his own words. When officers guided him into the interview room, he didn't look in my direction. But I saw the way his shoulders twitched, like he could feel me there. Like the truth had brushed the back of his neck. I stayed seated, staring at the closed door behind which they questioned him. Every few minutes, the muffled sound of raised voices leaked out. Not shouting, just pressure. The kind that builds when a person's story begins to crumble piece by piece under the weight of a single, simple question. Officer Hayes eventually returned, holding another folder, this one thinner, worn on the edges. He sat beside me, resting it on his knee. We found discrepancies in his original medical report, he said quietly, as if the file itself was listening. His injuries weren't consistent with the account he gave. I didn't know what to say. I just kept my gaze on the folder, the edges frayed like something that had been opened too many times and still never understood. Hayes continued. One of the injuries, the timing doesn't match. It couldn't have happened in the accident. The room felt smaller suddenly, but not heavier, no lighter, like a window had been cracked open somewhere. I nodded, slow and careful, as if agreeing with gravity itself. When they finally escorted Reno out of the interview room, the hallway lights flickered overhead. He looked paler than I remembered. His eyes darted everywhere except toward mine. There was a tremor in his hand, small but real, the kind of shake that doesn't come from cold, but from truth trying to break the skin. Our eyes met for the briefest second. His dropped immediately. I watched him disappear down the corridor, officers flanking him on both sides. The hallway swallowed the sound of their footsteps, and all that remained was silence. Clean silence. The kind that follows something decisive. Officer Hayes returned again. Slower this time, like he was choosing his words before he even sat. We're re-evaluating everything, he said. The witness statements, the technical data, the scene reconstruction. Some of the old evidence should have been flagged earlier. It wasn't. He paused. We're fixing that now. I let the words settle inside me. Not like stones. Not like burdens. But like keys. For years, guilt had been the room I lived in. A windowless place where every breath felt borrowed. But as Hayes spoke, I felt something shift inside my ribs. An opening. A small one, but real enough to let a thread of warm air seep in. I whispered, "Thank you." It was all I could manage. All I needed to. Hayes nodded once, gently, then stood to return to his work. I stayed seated, letting my heartbeat readjust to a world where truth was no longer the enemy. By the time I stepped outside again, the frost on the railing had melted. Sunlight fell across the parking lot in pale stripes, warming patches of asphalt while leaving others cold. A thin breeze brushed my face, carrying the faint smell of pine from somewhere far away. For the first time in a long while, I inhaled without bracing for the ache. I walked slowly toward my car, feeling the weight in my chest shift. Lighter, freer, unfamiliar. The kind of weight that doesn't crush but clears. I didn't know what the next day would bring, or what the investigation would uncover in full. But as I opened the car door, the morning light caught the dashboard and scattered softly across my hands. And in that quiet, broken gleam, I realized something simple. Maybe I didn't have to live inside the old story anymore. Not if the truth was finally stepping forward with me. The wind had been restless all morning, brushing against the windows like it was trying to warn me of something. I sat at the edge of the porch, watching dry leaves skip across the yard, moving in frantic little circles before getting caught in the fence. The air felt thin, stretched in a way that made each breath feel borrowed. Inside the house, the clock ticked too loudly. Outside, the world held its breath. I didn't know he was coming, but somehow the air did. It shifted the way it does before a storm. Quiet, then strangely expectant, like even the sky knew Ronald Pierce was about to show his cracks. I was folding laundry in the living room when I heard the tires on gravel. The kind of sound that doesn't belong to strangers. I froze with a towel in my hands, listening as the engine cut off and a car door slammed harder than it needed to. For a moment I just stood there, the cotton warming my fingers. The house felt too still, too watchful. When Ronald's footsteps came up the porch, each one landed like someone knocking on a memory I didn't want to open again. I felt something quiet move through me, not fear. Just a kind of tiredness, deep and steady. The kind you carry after years of being told a story that never belonged to you. I opened the door before he could knock. He stood there with his jaw clenched, eyes darting as if he'd been rehearsing every possible version of this moment. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie undone. His whole body pulled tight like a wire ready to snap. "Margaret," he said, and just my name sounded like an accusation. The wind pushed against his coat, rustling the edges, and I realized how small his shadow looked against the morning light. Smaller than it used to. Smaller than he wanted it to be. That was when I knew something inside him had begun to fracture. He stepped inside without waiting for an invite. Old habits, old patterns. He walked straight to the center of the living room like he still owned the space, then turned sharply to face me. "You've been talking to the sheriff," he said. His voice was thin, almost brittle. I didn't answer. The silence made him flinch. "You're feeding them lies, Margaret. You're trying to twist this whole thing, turn it against me." He ran a hand through his hair, pacing between the coffee table and the window. "They're asking questions they shouldn't be asking. And I know where it's coming from." I watched him move, quick, scattered steps that didn't match the man who used to tower over every room. His shoulders weren't steady. His breath caught every few words. This wasn't the Ronald who once controlled conversations with a single raised brow. This was a man unraveling in real time. "Do you think this makes you look innocent?" he snapped, though his voice cracked halfway through. "Do you think playing the victim will fix anything?" I didn't look away. I didn't apologize. I simply stood there, grounding myself in the weight of the floor beneath me. He didn't like that. He didn't expect that. Something inside him flickered, fear maybe. Or the realization that whatever power he thought he had over me wasn't there anymore. His pacing stopped. His eyes looked glassy, unfocused, as if even he didn't fully believe the story he was clinging to. "Don't do this, Margaret," he whispered, but the words trembled. "Don't drag my name through the mud just because you can't handle the truth." I felt the corner of my throat tighten, not from fear, but from something quieter, something like clarity. "The truth." I spoke softly, barely above the hum of the refrigerator. "It's finally coming out, Ronald. Whether either of us likes it or not." He blinked, startled. Not by the words, but by the sound of my voice. Firm. And shaken. For a long moment he just stared at me. And I watched it happen. The slow collapse of whatever story he'd built, brick by brick, around both our lives. His face twitched, his breath hitched, and his shoulders sagged as though the weight he carried finally became heavier than his pride. Then he lashed out, not physically, but with the only thing he had left. "You're destroying everything," he spat. "You and your pathetic need to feel innocent." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned toward the door, yanking it open so hard the hinges groaned. The wind rushed in, scattering dust across the floor as he stormed out of the house and down the porch steps. I stood perfectly still long after his car sped away. The house creaked softly, like it too felt something slip free. A moment later, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. Sheriff Dalton's name glowed on the screen. My hands shook as I answered. "Margaret," he said gently, "we've reviewed the new evidence. Everything points to Andrew not being at fault." The room swayed a little around me. I didn't speak. I didn't have to. When the call ended, I sank slowly onto the couch. The cushions gave beneath me with a soft sigh, like they'd been waiting for this moment longer than I had. Sunlight slipped through the curtains in thin, trembling lines, touching my hands, my knees, the edge of the wooden floor. Felt warm. Warmer than I remembered. My breath stuttered, then steadied. Tears fell, silent and steady, slipping down my cheeks without the weight of grief, without the ache of guilt. Just release. Pure and simple. Like exhaling after years of holding the same breath. I leaned back, letting the quiet settle around me. Outside, the leaves brushed against the porch again, but they didn't sound frantic anymore. For the first time in a long while, the world didn't feel hostile. Felt possible. And deep in that quiet, I understood. Something heavy had finally let go. And this time, it wasn't me. The hallway outside the sheriff's office smelled faintly of old paper and rain-soaked jackets. I stood there for a moment, letting the hum of the fluorescent lights settle into my ears like a low, nervous heartbeat. The morning sun pushed through the narrow window at the end of the hall, catching dust in midair, tiny particles drifting in slow, careless circles. My hands were clasped together, resting against my coat, but they didn't feel like they belonged to me. Not entirely. Somewhere behind the closed door, detectives waited with answers I'd spent years too afraid to look for. Answers I once believed I didn't deserve. I took one small breath, then another, and walked inside. The room was colder than I expected. Not harsh, just steady, like the kind of cold that keeps a person awake. Two detectives sat at the table, their files stacked neatly, their expressions softening the moment they saw me. Sheriff Dalton stood near the window with his hands in his pockets. He gave me a small nod. The kind that says, "We're here. You're safe." I lowered myself into the chair across from them, the vinyl protesting softly beneath my weight. My coat bunched around my shoulders. I didn't adjust it. I didn't move at all. For years, I'd imagined this moment. Sometimes as a lifeline. Sometimes as a punishment. Detective Henson opened a folder with deliberate care. "Mrs. Whitford," he said gently, "thank you for coming in." I folded my fingers tighter but kept my eyes steady. He spread out several photographs. Skid marks, vehicle diagrams, time-stamped images faded with age. One by one, they formed a timeline I had never been allowed to see clearly. "We reconstructed the entire collision," he continued, using new modeling witness statements, and the recovered data from Ronald Pierce's truck. Hearing Ronald's name didn't hurt the way it used to. It didn't pierce. It just existed like an object growing lighter the longer you carry it. Dalton stepped closer, his boots soft against the linoleum. "We want you to hear this from us before anyone else." The room seemed to lean in, waiting. Detective Henson turned a sheet toward me. Lines, measurements, arrows. "Based on speed analysis," he said, tapping one section, "Ronald's truck was traveling nearly 15 miles over the limit. He crossed the center line twice in the 90 seconds before the crash." I stared at the page, not fully understanding the numbers but feeling the weight behind them. 15 miles over. 2 swerves. He slid another photograph forward. Tire tracks bending sharply across 2 lanes. "This," he said quietly, "is the moment Andrew tried to avoid him." The air inside the room thinned. My breath slipped out in a shaky exhale, but my eyes didn't fall away. They stayed on the lines, the curves, the truth. Dalton spoke from behind me, his voice steady but softened. It wasn't Andrew losing control. He reacted to Ronald. He did everything a trained driver should have done to avoid the impact. Another file opened. Another layer peeled back. The original officer misinterpreted the trajectory, Henson explained. His report was rushed and incomplete, and Ronald Pierce took advantage of that. Financially. I blinked slowly as the meaning settled. The years I spent drowning in guilt, years shaped by Ronald's anger, his accusations, his certainty, suddenly felt like someone else's story. Someone I had lived beside, not inside. The pages rustled as the detective folded his hands. "I'm very sorry, Mrs. Whitford. You were never at fault. Neither was Andrew." The world just for a moment went absolutely still. I didn't speak right away. Words felt too small for the space I was standing in, too fragile compared to the weight of the truth laid bare in front of me. Dalton pulled out a chair beside mine but didn't sit. "We'll be opening a full inquiry into Pierce's financial gain and the misrepresentation of the accident. You don't owe him anything, Margaret. Not legally. Not morally." The sound of my name struck something deep, something old. For so long, every version of who I was had been carved by guilt, shaped by the belief that I'd somehow failed the people I loved most. Now, that belief crumbled quietly, like old plaster giving way beneath fingertips. Detective Henson slid the final paper toward me, a printed statement summarizing the corrected findings. Simple, direct, unmistakably clear. I traced a trembling finger along the top edge. The laminate felt cool, grounding. "I didn't know," I whispered. "It was all I could manage." Dalton crouched slightly, meeting my eyes without leaning in too close. "You weren't supposed to know. Ronald made sure of that." My throat tightened, not with pain but with a slow, deep ache that felt like release. The kind that rises when a locked door finally cracks open after years of weather and weight. For the first time in a long while, I felt the ground beneath my feet. Steady, solid, like it had been waiting for me to stand on it again. Closed my eyes. The room quieted around me, holding the moment with gentle hands. When I stepped outside the sheriff's office, the air carried the faint scent of pine and wet pavement. It was brighter than before, sunlight catching on every surface as if the world had been freshly washed. I walked slowly toward my car, each step careful but certain. My coat brushed against my legs, a soft reminder of the body I still lived in, the body I could finally forgive. I paused with my hand on the door handle. The guilt that had shadowed me for decades didn't cling the way it used to. It lifted, light as morning fog dissolving under a rising sun. For the first time, breathing didn't feel like something I had to earn. I looked out across the parking lot, the sky stretching wide above it. Andrew wasn't at fault, and neither was I. The truth at last felt like mercy. The house felt different that morning. Not larger, not brighter, just mine. I walked down the hallway with my hand brushing the wall, feeling every tiny bump in the paint the way you touch the face of someone you've missed for too long. The air still smelled faintly of last night's rain, drifting through the cracked kitchen window. And for the first time in months, I wasn't afraid of the silence. It didn't press on my chest, didn't whisper accusations. It simply waited, patient and warm. And I realized, I had been away from my own life for years. When I reached the end of the hallway, the living room opened up before me like a memory I'd forgotten I loved. Morning light slipped through the lace curtains, turning the dust into slow-moving gold. It was such a soft sight, almost unbearably gentle, and yet it hit me like truth always does. This was the home I had once built with steady hands and hopeful thoughts. And almost, I had let it go. The paperwork to sell the house was still on the dining table. A thin stack of papers that had felt heavier than any grief I'd carried. I looked at them now, the signatures half filled, the pen still lying across the page, and I felt something inside me unclench. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was courage waking up too late but still waking up. Either way, I reached for the phone. My voice barely came out when the agent answered. "I'm canceling the sale," I whispered. There was a pause on the other end, confusion. Maybe frustration. But I didn't explain myself. I just said it again, stronger this time. When I hung up, I stood there for a long moment, letting the quiet fill every corner again, letting the house breathe with me. It wasn't victory. It wasn't defiance. It was return. A slow walk back into the life I thought I no longer deserved. They came in the late afternoon, my children. I heard their cars before I saw them, gravel popping softly under the weight of their tires. There was something nervous in their knock, a kind of held breath that had become common between us. When I opened the door, their eyes searched me first like they were checking for cracks. Checking whether today would be one of my disappearing days. I didn't say anything. I just stepped back and let them in. My daughter moved first. She wrapped her arms around me so tightly it stole my breath. Not desperate but relieved. My son followed, slower, his hand resting on my shoulder before pulling me close. He held on longer than usual, and when he let go, his eyes were shining in the kind of way he tried hard to hide. "You're staying?" he asked quietly. He nodded. "I'm staying." The words felt strange in my mouth, like something I wasn't used to choosing for myself. But as soon as I said it, something in the room softened. My children moved through the house like people returning to a place they thought they'd lost. They touched the furniture, straightened little things on shelves, sat down on the couch like it finally felt safe again. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. Their presence filled the house in a warm, human way I hadn't felt since before everything broke. For once, they weren't watching me out of fear. They were simply here. And I let myself be here too. After they left, the night settled quietly around me. I didn't turn on any lights. The living room held the darkness gently, like an old friend returning after years of distance. The faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound left. I sat in my favorite chair, the one Andrew used to call the thinking seat. I hadn't used it for thinking in a long time, just surviving. For a while I listened to the house. The way the floor creaked with temperature shifts. The soft whisper of wind outside the window. It didn't feel haunted anymore. Not by him. Not by the choices I made out of fear. Not by the pieces of myself I kept burying just to get through the days. A stillness settled over me. A kind I didn't recognize. Felt like peace but quieter. More patient. I reached for the small wooden box beneath the table. Inside it was blank stationery I'd bought years ago, thinking I'd write letters again someday. The paper smelled faintly of cedar. It almost made me smile. I wrote Andrew's name at the top. And then I didn't apologize. Not once. Instead I wrote the truth. That I had carried him, his shadow, his voice, his judgment, longer than he ever deserved. That I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't grieving. I wasn't even waiting. I was done. Not because I had defeated the past, but because it no longer owned me. When I folded the letter, the room felt different again. Lighter. As though the walls had finally stopped leaning inward. I didn't cry. I didn't smile either. I just exhaled, a long, quiet breath that felt like the first true release of my life. I set the letter in the wooden box and closed the lid with a soft click. The sound echoed gently through the room, settling into the silence like a final period at the end of a long sentence. Outside, the street was empty. A single porch light flickered somewhere down the block. And sitting there in the dark, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Beginning. A soft, steady beginning. Waiting for me to take the next step. I woke before the sun, the way I used to when life still felt simple. The house was dim, washed in a soft bluish gray that comes right before the world remembers its morning. I moved slowly through the kitchen, my slippers whispering against the cool linoleum. When I filled the kettle and set it on the stove, the sound of the water settling inside it felt louder than it should have. There was no letter on the counter. No envelope leaning against the fruit bowl like a silent threat. Just an empty space. And a quiet that finally felt clean. The coffee took its time brewing, sending out little curls of steam that fogged the window above the sink. Outside, the Oregon dawn stretched itself awake, first with a pale thread of pink along the treetops, then a slow widening glow that touched the rooftops across the street. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug and stepped onto the porch. The wood felt cold beneath my bare feet, but I didn't mind. The cold grounded me, reminding me I wasn't dreaming. Not anymore. The neighborhood was still. Not the tense kind of stillness I'd grown used to, but the natural sleepy quiet that comes when nothing is waiting to jump out of the dark. The only sound was a distant dog barking, muffled and harmless. For the first time in decades, I didn't brace myself when I looked back toward the door. I didn't expect to see his handwriting. Didn't expect a message that would pull me back into old wounds and old mistakes. The kitchen counter was empty, and the emptiness felt like a gift. I breathed in the crisp air, sharp with pine, touched with winter, and felt something settle into place inside me. No joy, not yet, but something steady, something that might eventually grow into it. The sheriff arrived mid-morning. I heard the tires crunch on the gravel before I ever saw him. Sheriff Daniels had a way of knocking that was firm but soft, like he never wanted to startle anyone more than they already were. "Morning, Margaret," he said, removing his hat as I opened the door. I nodded, stepping aside. "Come on in. Coffee's still warm." He accepted the offer but didn't drink right away. He stood in the kitchen, looking at the empty counter the same way I had hours earlier, as if the absence of something could still be loud. "We got confirmation," he finally said. His voice was steady, but there was a heaviness beneath it. "Ronald won't be walking away from this. Not this time." I didn't speak. I let the words find their place inside me. There were forged documents, misdirected payments, and a good deal of harassment masked behind those letters he kept sending you. His mouth tightened. "You won't be seeing any more envelopes like that. Ever." He set the cup down gently, almost apologetically. "You're safe now, Margaret. Truly." If the words sat in the air, unfamiliar but warm. I closed my eyes and let silence stretch between us. Not tension, just space for truth to settle after years of being buried under fear. When I opened them again, he gave a small, understanding nod, then let himself out without another word. The door clicked shut behind him, and the house felt still again. But this time the stillness wasn't empty. It was full of things I hadn't let myself feel in years. I walked back to the porch, the mug still warm in my hands. The sun had climbed higher now, washing the street in a soft, muted gold. A breeze moved through the tall trees, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and cedar. I sat down on the old rocking chair, the one Andrew used to tease me about keeping long after its best years. It creaked beneath me in a tired but familiar way, as if it remembered all the mornings we once shared here. And for the first time I didn't think of him with that tight, guilty knot in my chest. I thought of him the way you think of a story you finally know how to close. I took a long sip of coffee and stared out at the quiet street. Children would be getting ready for school soon. Neighbors would start their routines. Life would go on, with or without the weight I had been dragging behind me for half a lifetime. A thought drifted through me then, slow and hesitant but true. I could build something new. Not grand, not dramatic, just peaceful. A life where I didn't have to apologize every morning for breathing. The realization didn't hit like lightning. It landed softly like snow. The sky had fully opened by the time I finished my coffee. Clouds drifted lazily above the rooftops, thin and white and harmless. I leaned back in the rocking chair and let it sway, the steady rhythm comforting in its simplicity. There was no fear waiting behind the door. No letter waiting to remind me of the past. No voice telling me what I owed. Just this morning, this porch, this quiet Oregon street where the world felt like it was finally beginning again. I breathed in the cold air one more time, deeper this time with a kind of quiet hunger, and let my shoulders fall. For the first time in decades, the future didn't look like something I had to survive. It looked like something I might choose. And maybe something that might finally choose me back.